In the dense, mist-choked heart of the Appalachian Mountains, the Calloway family was about to uncover something that should have remained hidden. What started as a simple hiking trip turned into a nightmare when their youngest, Sadie, strayed from the trail and stumbled upon an ancient vine-covered door embedded in the mountainside. Daniel Calloway wasn't just another weekend backpacker. For 20 years, he had served as a reconnaissance specialist in the U.S. Army, known for navigating the most hostile terrains and surviving against impossible odds. When his son Ethan, eager to prove himself, pried open the decayed wood, none of them realized they were breaking a seal older than civilization itself. The Calloways had unknowingly invited something back into the world, something that had waited centuries for release, and it had been waiting for them. What began as a peaceful family retreat would soon become a desperate fight against an entity that had no face but countless eyes, no voice but endless whispers. The mountains would remember their names, but they would never be the same after what came through that door. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mist curled through the trees like ghostly fingers as the Calloway family made their way up the narrow mountain trail. The forest canopy above them filtered the afternoon sunlight into dappled patterns that shifted and danced across the damp earth. Daniel Calloway checked his GPS again, his weathered face tightening with determination. "We need to reach Blackwater Ridge before sunset," he announced, not looking back at his family trailing behind him. "That gives us about 3 hours. We can make it if we keep a steady pace." 17-year-old Ethan rolled his eyes, adjusting his heavy backpack with a dramatic sigh. "Why can't we just camp here? We've already hiked 6 miles today." "Because," Daniel replied with the practiced patience of a man who'd explained military strategy to civilians, "Blackwater Ridge has the best view and a natural clearing. It's in the plan." "The plan?" "Of course." Ethan exchanged a knowing glance with his mother, Elise, who gave him a small, sympathetic smile. Everything with his father was about the plan: meticulously researched routes, precisely timed rest periods, and carefully chosen camp locations. 3 days in the Appalachian wilderness, scheduled down to the minute. Elise quickened her pace to walk beside her husband. "Daniel, the mist is getting thicker. Maybe we should consider—" "It'll burn off," he cut in, his tone softening only slightly for her. "Trust me, I've hiked this section before. This happens in the afternoons." Behind them, 13-year-old Sadie trailed her fingers along the ferns lining the path, her artist's eyes taking in the subtle variations of green. She hummed quietly to herself, occasionally stopping to examine interesting rocks or peculiar mushrooms that caught her attention. "Sadie, keep up," Daniel called back without turning. "Stay on the trail." "I am," she replied, though she wasn't. Not entirely. The forest seemed to beckon her a few steps to the right or left, promising discoveries just beyond the maintained path. The family trip, Daniel's idea, was meant to repair what had been fracturing for years. Ethan's recent suspension from school had been the breaking point, the culmination of a slow-building rebellion against his father's rigid expectations. Elise had grown quieter over the years, her once adventurous spirit diminished to occasional wistful comments about trips never taken. And Sadie, sensitive Sadie, had withdrawn into her art, creating intricate drawings of forests and hidden creatures that seemed more real to her than the tension-filled home they shared. As they rounded a bend in the trail, the mist thickened, unexpectedly, swirling around their ankles like cold water. Elise shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Daniel, I really think—" A cry from behind cut her off. They turned to see Sadie several yards off the trail, partially obscured by a cluster of rhododendrons. "Mom? Dad? Look what I found." Daniel's face hardened. "Sadie, what did I just say about staying on the trail?" But Elise was already moving toward her daughter, concern overriding her husband's irritation. Ethan followed, secretly glad for any delay that might convince his father to make camp early. They found Sadie standing before what appeared to be a section of the mountainside that didn't quite match its surroundings. Vines and moss covered most of it, but beneath the tangle of growth was something unnatural, flat and vertical where the mountain should have curved. "It's a door," Sadie said, her voice hushed with wonder. "In the mountain." Daniel stepped forward, frowning as he brushed away some of the vines. Indeed, beneath the vegetation was what appeared to be an ancient wooden door, its surface weathered to a silvery gray. It was tall, nearly 7 feet, and appeared to be made from a single slab of wood so old it seemed almost petrified. "Probably an old mining entrance," Daniel said dismissively, though uncertainty tinged his voice. "This area has a history of coal mining." Elise reached out hesitantly, then drew her hand back before touching the surface. "I don't think so. Look at these markings." Around the edges of the door, partially obscured by vines and dirt, were intricate carvings, symbols rather than letters, spiraling patterns that seemed to flow into one another. They reminded Sadie of her own drawings, and she reached out to trace them with her fingertip. "Don't touch it," Elise said sharply, pulling Sadie's hand back. Ethan stepped closer, fascination overriding his perpetual teenage disinterest. "These don't look like mining markers, they're too deliberate." "It's probably just some elaborate trail marker," Daniel said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Or maybe an old root cellar door from when settlers lived in these parts." "In the side of a mountain?" Ethan challenged. "It could have been built into an existing structure," Daniel countered, falling into their familiar pattern of disagreement. While they argued, Sadie continued to study the carvings. Though she couldn't read them, they seemed to shift under her gaze, as if trying to form words she could understand. A chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "We should keep moving," Elise said suddenly, her voice tight. "Something doesn't feel right about this place." Daniel checked his watch, torn between curiosity and his precious schedule. "We still have plenty of daylight. A quick look won't hurt." "I want to see what's behind it," Ethan said, already moving forward to clear more vines. "No," Elise said, her voice uncharacteristically firm. "Let's just go." But Ethan was already pulling at the thick vines, revealing more of the ancient door and its strange markings. Sadie joined him, drawn by a curiosity she couldn't explain. "Mom, look at this part," she said, pointing to a section near the bottom of the door. The carvings there seemed more urgent somehow, the lines deeper and more jagged than the flowing patterns above. Elise reluctantly moved closer, her face paling as she studied the markings. "I think these might be warnings." "You can't possibly know that," Daniel said, though he sounded less certain. "I don't need to read them to feel it," Elise replied softly. Ethan had cleared enough of the door to reveal a simple iron handle, black with age but surprisingly intact. "Only one way to find out," he said, gripping it firmly. "Ethan, don't," Daniel began, but it was too late. With a defiant glance at his father, Ethan pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. The door seemed fused to its frame by centuries of disuse. Then, with a sound like a distant sigh, it moved. Just an inch at first, then wider as Ethan pulled harder. The hinges, if there were any, made no sound at all. Beyond the door was only darkness, a perfect, absolute black that seemed to swallow the misty daylight without reflection. "That's weird," Ethan said, his bravado faltering. "Shouldn't we see something?" A hollow silence emanated from the opening, as if the darkness beyond was listening. Then, as they all stood frozen in place, the silence broke. Not with a sound, but with its absence. The forest around them, which had been filled with the subtle music of birds and insects, went completely still. "Close it," Elise whispered, backing away. "Close it now." Ethan pushed against the door and it swung shut with unexpected ease. The moment it closed, a gust of wind shook the trees around them, and the sounds of the forest returned. The distant call of a wood thrush, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of insects. "Just an old storage cellar," Daniel said with forced casualness. "Nothing to see. We should keep moving if we want to reach the ridge before dark." As the family turned to leave, Sadie lingered, staring at the door now partially hidden again by the vines that seemed to be reclaiming it with unnatural speed. In the moment before she turned away, she heard it, a whisper so faint she almost believed she'd imagined it. "Sadie." She whirled around, but there was no one there. Just the door, silent and still once more. "Sadie, come on," Daniel called from the trail. With one last glance at the door, Sadie hurried after her family, the whisper of her name echoing in her mind. Behind her, unseen, the carvings on the ancient wood seemed to shift, rearranging themselves into new patterns as the mist coiled more thickly around the doorframe. The Calloways continued their hike, unaware that with each step the forest around them was subtly changing. The trees growing slightly closer together, the shadows stretching a little longer than they should, and something unseen now following, quietly behind them. They reached Blackwater Ridge just as the sun began its descent behind the distant mountains. The clearing was exactly as Daniel had described, a flat expanse of ground surrounded by towering oak and pine, with a breathtaking view of the valley below. Under normal circumstances, it would have been perfect, but nothing felt normal anymore. "See? Right on schedule," Daniel announced, dropping his pack with satisfied precision. His voice carried an edge of forced cheerfulness that didn't quite mask the tension in his shoulders. "We'll have the tents up before dark." Elise nodded absently, her gaze drawn to the darkening forest behind them. Since leaving the door, she'd felt a persistent prickling between her shoulder blades, as if someone or something was watching them. She'd checked behind them several times during their hike, only to find nothing but mist and trees. "Mom, are you okay?" Sadie asked, tugging at her sleeve. Elise forced a smile. "Just tired, sweetie. Let's help your father set up camp." As they worked, the familiar routine of pitching tents and gathering firewood provided a comforting sense of normalcy. Daniel moved with practiced efficiency, assigning tasks and checking items off his mental list. By the time darkness fell completely, they had a crackling fire going and dinner cooking over the flames. "Perfect timing," Daniel said, checking his watch with satisfaction. "We'll eat, get some rest, and tomorrow we'll reach Echo Lake by noon." Ethan poked at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks spiral upward. "That door was weird, wasn't it?" he said suddenly. "I mean, who builds a door into the side of a mountain?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "It was probably just an old mine entrance. Like I said, didn't look like any mine entrance I've ever seen," Ethan persisted. "Because you're such an expert on Appalachian mining history?" Daniel's voice had that dangerous edge to it, the one that usually preceded their worst arguments. "Stop," Elise said quietly. "Please, let's just have a nice dinner." The conversation shifted to safer topics, but as they ate, Elise noticed Sadie had grown unusually quiet. The girl sat cross-legged by the fire, her notebook open on her lap, her pencil moving in fluid, continuous strokes across the page. "What are you drawing, honey?" Elise asked, moving closer. Sadie didn't look up. "I don't know. It just feels right." Elise glanced down at the page and felt her blood run cold. Covering the paper were intricate swirling patterns, almost identical to the carvings they'd seen on the door. Sadie had never been close enough to study them in detail, yet here they were, flowing from her pencil with unsettling precision. "That's very pretty," Elise managed, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Where did you get the idea for those designs?" Sadie shrugged, still focused on her drawing. "They're just in my head." Across the fire, Daniel was showing Ethan how to check the weather forecast on his specialized hiking GPS. Neither of them noticed when Sadie set aside her notebook, picked up a stick, and began absently tracing the same patterns in the dirt beside her. The night deepened. After they'd cleaned up from dinner, Daniel insisted on their standard camping ritual, stories around the fire. It was meant to be bonding time, but tonight, the familiar tales of Daniel's military adventures and Elise's childhood memories felt hollow against the backdrop of the whispering forest. When they finally retreated to their tents, parents in one, children in the other, Elise lay awake, listening. The wind had picked up, sending strange sounds echoing through the trees. Whispers, almost like voices, rose and fell with each gust. Beside her, Daniel slept deeply, his breathing steady and untroubled. How could he not hear it? The sounds were becoming more distinct, Not just formless whispers anymore, but syllables, fragments of words that hovered just beyond comprehension. In the other tent, Ethan stared at the nylon ceiling, fighting the urge to wake Sadie, who had fallen into an unnaturally deep sleep almost immediately. The sounds outside weren't just wind, he was sure of it. Tap, tap, tap. It was subtle at first, so faint he thought he might be imagining it. But there it was again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling their campsite. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to pause near each tent before continuing their circuit. Ethan sat up, heart pounding. "Sadie," he whispered, shaking his sister gently. "Sadie, wake up." She didn't stir, her face peaceful in the dim light filtering through the tent fabric. The footsteps paused directly outside their tent. Ethan held his breath, straining to hear over the pounding of his heart. Something was out there, standing still, listening. Gathering his courage, Ethan unzipped the tent flap just enough to peer outside. The campfire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a feeble circle of light that barely reached the tent. Beyond that light, the forest was an impenetrable wall of darkness. Except for one spot just beyond the dying firelight's reach, there something stood. A figure too tall and too thin to be human, its proportions wrong in ways Ethan couldn't quite define. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Its stillness was somehow more terrifying than any movement could have been. "Dad!" Ethan called, his voice cracking with fear. "Dad, there's something—" In the instant he called out, the figure vanished, not running or walking away, but simply ceasing to be there at all. By the time Daniel emerged from his tent, flashlight in hand, there was nothing to see. "What is it?" Daniel demanded, sweeping the beam of light across the clearing. "I saw something," Ethan said, aware of how childish he sounded. "Just outside the light from the fire, something was watching us." Daniel's expression flickered between concern and irritation. "Probably just a deer," he said after a moment. "Or maybe a black bear, though they usually avoid campsites with fires." "It wasn't an animal," Ethan insisted. "It was standing, on two legs." "Could have been a bear," Daniel repeated firmly. "They stand up sometimes. Nothing to worry about. We've got the food secured in the bear canister away from the tents." As they argued, neither noticed Sadie sitting up in her sleeping bag, eyes open but unfocused, her fingers tracing patterns on the tent floor that matched the ones in her notebook. Eventually, Daniel convinced Ethan to return to his tent, promising to keep the fire stoked higher for the rest of the night. But as Ethan crawled back inside, he found Sadie fully awake, staring at him with an odd expression. "They're coming closer," she whispered. "Who is?" Ethan asked, a chill running down his spine. Sadie blinked, her expression clearing. "What? I didn't say anything." Before Ethan could respond, a scream tore through the night. Elise, in the other tent. Daniel was already at her side when Ethan and Sadie reached them. Elise sat rigid, in her sleeping bag, eyes wide with terror, breath coming in sharp gasps. "The door," she managed between breaths. "The door opened. I saw it in my dream. It opened by itself, and something came through." "It was just a nightmare," Daniel said, holding her shoulders. "Just a bad dream." Elise shook her head violently. "No, it wasn't. It was real. Whatever was behind that door, it's free now and it's following us." "Mom, you're scaring Sadie," Daniel said, though Sadie didn't look frightened. She looked oddly fascinated. "It's okay," Sadie said, her voice strangely adult. "They just want to talk to us." Every head turned to her. "Who wants to talk to us?" Daniel asked carefully. Sadie blinked, looking confused. I don't know why I said that." A heavy silence fell over the family, broken only by the wind through the trees, a wind that now seemed to carry words becoming clearer with each passing moment. "Daniel, Elise, Ethan, Sadie." Their names whispered one by one, drifting through the darkness like fallen leaves. This time, they all heard it. Even Daniel couldn't deny the sound of his own name being called by something that wasn't human. "We leave at first light," he said, his face pale in the beam of the flashlight. "We're going back to the trailhead." No one argued. Outside their tents, at the very edge of where the firelight reached, a figure stood watching, too tall, too thin, and utterly silent. It would be gone before any of them looked, but it didn't matter. It didn't need to be seen to follow them. Now, it already knew their names. No one slept after hearing their names called in the darkness. They huddled together in Daniel and Elise's tent, flashlights on, waiting for dawn with the desperate hope that morning light would restore normalcy. When the first gray light finally filtered through the trees, they emerged to find the campsite, shrouded in an unnatural mist, thicker than it should have been, moving in ways that defied the gentle morning breeze. "Pack up," Daniel ordered, his voice tight. "We're leaving, now." They worked in silent efficiency, dismantling tents and gathering gear with none of their usual breakfast rituals or morning conversations. Each of them kept glancing toward the surrounding forest, as if expecting to see something watching from between the trees. Sadie moved mechanically, her eyes unfocused. Twice, Elise had to redirect her when she found her daughter standing motionless, staring into the mist. The second time, she noticed Sadie's lips moving silently, forming words Elise couldn't read. "Sadie, honey, are you feeling okay?" Elise asked, pressing a palm to her daughter's forehead. Sadie blinked rapidly, her eyes clearing. "I'm fine, just tired." By the time they shouldered their packs, the sun had risen higher, though its light seemed strangely diffused through the mist, casting no shadows. "The trail back to the main path is this way," Daniel said, pointing toward a gap in the trees to the east of their campsite. "We follow it down for about 2 miles, then hit the junction. From there, it's a straight shot back to the trailhead." Ethan frowned. "That's not right. We came up from the south yesterday." "No," Daniel said firmly, consulting his GPS. "We came from the east. The coordinates show—" He stopped, tapping the device with growing frustration. "That's not possible. The GPS says we're half a mile from where we camped last night. Maybe it's got a low battery," Ethan suggested. Daniel shook his head. "It's fully charged." He looked up, scanning the clearing with increasing uncertainty. "Let's just follow the trail down. I know it connects to the main path eventually." They set off in the direction Daniel indicated, moving quickly despite their heavy packs. The trail seemed narrower than Elise remembered, the underbrush thicker on either side. The trees loomed closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that blocked much of the morning light. After 20 minutes of hiking, Daniel stopped abruptly. "This isn't right." "What do you mean?" Elise asked, though she already knew. The forest felt wrong, older, wilder than the well-maintained trail they'd hiked the day before. "The trail markers," Daniel said, turning in a slow circle. "There should be blue blazes on the trees. I haven't seen a single one." "Maybe we took a wrong turn," Ethan suggested, though there had been no forks in the path. "Impossible," Daniel muttered, checking his GPS again. "According to this, we've been going in circles. But that can't be right." Elise touched his arm gently. "Daniel, I think we need to consider that something unusual is happening here." "Don't start with that," he snapped, pulling away. "There's a logical explanation. We just need to get our bearings." He dug in his pack for his paper map and compass. "The sun is east, so if we head due west, we should intersect the main trail eventually." Ethan had wandered a few yards back, studying the ground. "Dad," he called, his voice strained. "Come look at this." They joined him, staring, down at the soft earth of the trail. Their own footprints led clearly back the way they had come, but only for about 20 feet. Beyond that, the trail was pristine, undisturbed by any human passage. "That's impossible," Daniel whispered. "We just walked that way." "Our footprints," Ethan said, swallowing hard. "They're being erased." As if to confirm his words, they watched in horrified silence as the nearest set of prints slowly smoothed over, the dirt shifting by itself until no trace remained. Daniel backed away, his face pale. No, that's not possible. It's just, the soil is loose. Or maybe there's an underground spring causing settlement. Daniel, Elise said sharply. Stop it. You know that's not what's happening. For the first time in their marriage, Elise saw real fear in her husband's eyes, the kind of bone-deep terror he'd never shown, not even in his worst moments in combat. It frightened her more than their vanishing footprints. It's because you opened that door, Daniel said suddenly, turning on Ethan. You just had to push it, didn't you? Couldn't follow one simple instruction to leave it alone. Me? Ethan's voice cracked with indignation. You're the one who insisted we keep hiking when Mom wanted to turn back. You're the one who dragged us on this stupid trip in the first place. Stop it, Elise shouted, stepping between them. This isn't helping. As they argued, none of them noticed Sadie wandering a few steps away, her head tilted as if listening to something only she could hear. By the time Elise turned to check on her, Sadie was staring intently into the trees to their right. Sadie, Elise called. Stay close, honey. Sadie didn't respond, continuing to stare into the forest. Elise followed her gaze and felt her breath catch in her throat. Just beyond the nearest trees stood a figure, humanoid but wrong somehow, its proportions subtly distorted. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Though Elise couldn't make out its face through the mist, she felt it watching them. Daniel, she whispered, not taking her eyes off the figure. Daniel, look. But when Daniel turned, the figure was gone, the mist swirling in the space where it had stood. There was something there, Elise insisted. Something watching us. Daniel's jaw tightened. Let's keep moving. We need to find the main trail. They continued walking, choosing a direction that seemed to lead downhill, hoping it would eventually bring them to familiar territory. The forest grew denser, the trees pressing closer, their trunks gnarled and ancient in a way that made no sense for the relatively young forest of this part of the Appalachians. As they walked, Elise kept seeing movements just at the edge of her vision, tall, thin figures that vanished whenever she turned to look, directly at them. She said nothing, afraid of what Daniel might say, afraid of frightening the children further. But when she glanced at Ethan, she saw in his eyes that he was seeing them too. Only Sadie seemed unafraid, walking with an almost dreamlike serenity. Then, so softly that Elise almost missed it, Sadie began to murmur under her breath. The words were unfamiliar, a language that sounded ancient with harsh consonants and flowing vowels that no 13-year-old should know. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Nahara vos ethral mandar. Sadie? Elise touched her daughter's shoulder. What did you just say? Sadie looked up, her eyes momentarily confused. I didn't say anything, Mom. Yes, you did. You were speaking something. Not English. Sadie shook her head. No, I wasn't. Before Elise could press further, Daniel called them to a halt. Ahead, the path they'd been following simply ended, terminated in a solid wall of densely packed trees that seemed to have grown together, their trunks fused in places to form an impenetrable barrier. This isn't possible, Daniel said for what felt like the 100th time. None of this makes sense. We need to go back to the door, Elise said suddenly, the conviction in her voice surprising even her. Whatever's happening started there. We don't even know where it is anymore, Daniel exclaimed. Nothing looks the same. The trails are changing, the GPS is useless. Sadie knows, Ethan said quietly. They all turned to look at him. She's been looking at the trees, listening to something. I think whatever came through that door is talking to her. They looked at Sadie, who stared back with an expression that shifted between confusion and something older, more knowing. Sadie, Elise said gently, kneeling before her daughter. Can you hear it? Can you hear what came through the door? Sadie's eyes grew distant. They've been here a long time. Waiting. They were trapped. but now they're free. And they want to play. Play? Daniel echoed. What does that mean? As if in answer, a sound rolled through the forest. A low, guttural laugh that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The mist swirled faster around them, and the trees creaked and groaned, as if bending in a strong wind, though the air was still. Did you think you could leave? The voice was no longer a whisper. It resonated through the trees, through the ground beneath their feet. The game has only just begun. The laughter came again, louder this time, echoing through the forest, until it seemed the trees themselves were laughing at them, a sound of ancient, inhuman amusement that froze their blood and stole their breath. They were being toyed with, Elise realized. Whatever had been imprisoned behind that door was free now, and it was playing with them like a cat with mice. And somehow she knew, with dreadful certainty, they were meant to be more than just its entertainment. They were meant to be its prey. The laughter faded, leaving behind an oppressive silence. For several minutes, the Calloways stood frozen, huddled together at the edge of the impassable wall of trees. Finally, Daniel squared his shoulders, his military training reasserting itself in the face of terror. "We're going to try again," he announced, voice strained but determined. "We're going to pick a direction and stick to it no matter what." "But the trails keep changing," Ethan protested. "Then we'll mark our path," Daniel countered, unsheathing his hunting knife. He moved to the nearest tree and carved a deep X into the bark. "Every 20 yards, we mark a tree. That way we'll know if we're going in circles." No one pointed out the futility of this plan after witnessing their footprints being erased before their eyes. Hope, even false hope, was better than surrender to the growing terror around them. Daniel chose what he believed was north, using his compass despite its erratic behavior, and they began walking. Every 20 paces he stopped to mark another tree, the sharp sound of his knife against bark, the only noise in the unnaturally quiet forest. They had gone perhaps a quarter mile when Ethan noticed something odd about the trees ahead. "Dad," he called softly, "look at that one." Daniel followed his son's pointing finger to a massive oak about 30 yards ahead. At first he saw nothing unusual, but as they drew closer he noticed a dark oval in the trunk, perfectly smooth, as if someone had cut a hole in the bark and painted the inside black, except it wasn't paint. "Stay back," Daniel ordered as Elise moved toward it. "Don't touch anything." Elise ignored him, drawn by a horrifying fascination. The oval wasn't a hole or a mark. It was an eye. Not a human eye, not an animal eye, but something else entirely. A void in the shape of an eye, depthless and ancient, watching them from within the living wood. "Daniel," she whispered, "it's looking at us." As if her words had triggered something, they suddenly noticed more eyes appearing in the surrounding trees, dozens of them opening slowly like wounds in the bark. Not glowing or colorful, just absolute darkness in the shape of eyes watching from every direction. Daniel backed away, knife raised uselessly. "Keep moving," he hissed. "Don't look at them." They pressed forward, but the eyes followed their progress, turning within the wood to track their movement. Worse, with each new tree they passed, more eyes appeared until the forest seemed alive with silent watchers. 10 minutes later, Daniel stopped to mark another tree, only to freeze mid-cut. What the hell? There, carved deep into the bark, was an X, identical to the marks he'd been making. "That's impossible," he muttered. "We've been going in a straight line." "Is it one of yours?" Elise asked. "It must be," Daniel said, though doubt colored his voice. "But that would mean we're going in circles," Ethan finished flatly. Daniel shook his head violently. No, we've been maintaining a straight course. The compass hasn't worked right since we opened the door," Elise reminded him gently. Daniel's control finally snapped. He slammed his fist against the marked tree. "This is insane. We've been walking straight north. How can we be back where we started?" "Maybe the forest is changing around us," Ethan suggested, his voice unnervingly calm. "Maybe it's moving while we walk." The thought was so disturbing that even Daniel had no logical counter-argument. They stood in defeated silence until Elise gasped suddenly, pointing to a nearby tree they'd just passed. "The mark," she said. "It's gone." Daniel rushed back to check. The X he'd carved less than 5 minutes ago had vanished, the bark smooth and unblemished as if never touched. "No," he whispered, running back to check his earlier marks. One by one, they found each tree he'd marked, all now unmarked, all watching them with those terrible void eyes. Daniel's composure crumbled, visibly. He began slashing wildly at the nearest tree, carving mark after mark into its bark. "Daniel, stop!" Elise cried, grabbing his arm. "It won't help!" He wrenched away from her. "Then what will? What the hell are we supposed to do?" While her parents argued, Sadie wandered a few paces away, tilting her head as if listening to distant music. When Elise finally noticed her absence, she found her daughter standing beneath a low-hanging branch, staring up at something swaying gently in the non-existent breeze. "Sadie, what is it?" Elise approached cautiously, then recoiled as she saw what had captured her daughter's attention. Hanging from the branch was a crude totem. Small animal bones and what looked disturbingly like human finger bones, woven together with strands of dark hair into a shape that suggested a door. It twisted slowly, though there was no wind to move. It's a warning," Sadie said softly. "Or maybe an invitation." "Don't touch it," Elise ordered, pulling Sadie away. "Daniel, Ethan." They hurried over, Daniel's face hardening when he saw the totem. "Someone's messing with us," he growled. "This is someone's sick idea of a joke." "Who?" Elise demanded. "We haven't seen another person since we started hiking." "I don't know," Daniel admitted, his voice cracking. "I don't know anymore." As they stood arguing, Ethan felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched beyond the countless void eyes in the trees. He turned slowly, scanning the forest, and saw nothing but mist and shadows. Then he heard it. "Ethan," his mother's voice calling softly from deeper in the forest. "Ethan, come here. I need to show you something." He turned to his mother, standing just a few feet away, arguing with his father. "What?" he asked. Elise looked at him in confusion. "I didn't say anything." "Ethan, please, help me." The voice came again, unmistakably his mother's, filled with quiet desperation, but Elise's lips hadn't moved. "I can hear you calling me," Ethan said, his voice tight with fear. "From over there." Elise's face paled. "That's not me, Ethan." "Don't listen to it." "Ethan, your father can't save us. Only you can find the way back. Follow my voice." The false Elise's voice grew more insistent, more convincing. For a bewildering moment, Ethan couldn't tell which was real, the mother beside him or the one calling from the forest. "It's in our heads," Elise said suddenly, understanding dawning. "It's learning how to manipulate us. Daniel, we need to stay together. It's trying to separate us." Daniel nodded grimly, some of his old resolve returning. "Nobody goes anywhere alone. Not even a few steps. We hold hands if we have to." As they clustered closer together, Sadie looked around at the trees with their watching eyes and smiled slightly. "They're curious," she whispered, not to her family but to something else. "They haven't seen humans in a very long time." "Sadie?" Elise touched her daughter's arm. "Who are you talking to?" "The Watchers," Sadie replied simply. "They're in the trees. They're part of it. The thing from behind the door." "What do they want?" Daniel asked, surprising them all by engaging with Sadie's claims. Sadie tilted her head as if listening. "They want to know if we're worthy." "Worthy of what?" Ethan demanded. But Sadie just smiled, that strange, distant smile, again. As they stood in the unchanging twilight of the forest, Elise suddenly realized something she should have noticed hours ago. "The sun," she said, pointing up through the canopy. "It should be overhead by now, but it hasn't moved. It's still in the same position as when we started walking this morning." They all looked up. The sun was visible as a pale disk through the mist and branches frozen in the eastern sky where it had been hours ago. "Time isn't passing," Ethan whispered, "or it's passing differently." Daniel checked his watch, then held it to his ear. It stopped. When did it stop? No one answered because no one knew. Their phones were dead too, though they should have had battery life. "It's getting darker, though," Elise observed. "Look." Indeed, despite the sun's fixed position, the forest was growing dimmer, the shadows longer, the eyes in the trees more visible in the fading light. "It's controlling everything," Elise realized aloud. "The forest, time, what we see and hear. It's all part of whatever came through that door. And it's getting stronger," Daniel added grimly. As if in confirmation, the wind rose suddenly through the trees, not a natural wind but a focused gust that swirled around them, carrying whispers in a dozen voices. The trees groaned, their trunks creaking as they seemed to lean inward, the watching eyes narrowing. "The sun is setting," Sadie announced with calm certainty. "And it won't rise again unless we do what they want." "What do they want?" Daniel asked, fear finally naked in his voice. Sadie looked at each of them and turned her eyes no longer entirely her own. "They want one of us to take its place," she said, behind the door. Sadie's words hung in the air between them, heavy with terrible implication. Before anyone could respond, the forest darkened rapidly, as if someone were dimming the lights. On a stage, the sun, which had remained frozen in the eastern sky all day, suddenly plummeted toward the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach for them like grasping hands. "We need to find shelter," Daniel said, his voice steadier than it had been in hours. The concrete threat of nightfall had given him something tangible to fight against. "Let's move." "Which way?" Ethan asked, looking around at the identical trees with their watching eyes. Daniel hesitated, then pointed in the direction that seemed to have the fewest eyes. "That way." They moved quickly, holding on to each other to avoid separation. The darkness grew thicker around them, not the gentle gloaming of natural dusk, but something oppressive that seemed to press against their skin. The void eyes in the trees glowed faintly now, providing just enough light to navigate by. "Look," Elise said suddenly, pointing ahead. "What's that?" Through the trees they could make out a clearing where the unnatural darkness seemed slightly less dense. As they approached, they saw it wasn't a natural clearing at all, but a circle of standing stones surrounding a central altar. A massive slab of dark rock that seemed to absorb what little light remained. "Don't go near it," Daniel warned. But Elise was already moving forward, drawn by the same inexplicable certainty that had been guiding her since they found the door. "These symbols," she said, running her fingers over the carvings in the altar stone. "They're the same as the ones on the door." The rest of the family followed hesitantly. The altar was covered in spiraling patterns that matched the door's carvings exactly. But here they were more extensive, telling a story in a language none of them could read, but that somehow conveyed meaning through their mere existence. As Elise traced the patterns, something shifted in the air around them. The forest went completely silent. Even the whispering voices that had been their constant companions fell quiet. "Elise?" Daniel called, his voice sounding oddly flat in the stillness. But Elise didn't respond. Her fingers had stopped moving over the carvings, and she stood frozen, her eyes wide and unfocused. Then, without warning, she collapsed. Daniel lunged forward, catching her before she hit the ground. "Elise!" he cried, cradling her limp form. "Elise, wake up!" Her eyes remained open but unseeing, pupils dilated into perfect black circles that reflected nothing. Her body was rigid in his arms, every muscle tensed. "Mom!" Ethan knelt beside them, his face pale with fear. "What's happening to her?" "I don't know," Daniel said, genuine terror in his voice. He had faced combat, had stared down death, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of his wife possessed by something beyond his understanding. Sadie approached slowly, her head tilted in that now familiar listening posture. "She's seeing," she said simply. Seeing what? Daniel demanded. The beginning and the end. Inside Elise's mind, images flashed with brutal clarity, not like a dream or even a vision, but as if she were physically present, watching events unfold across centuries. She saw the mountain as it had been long before European settlers arrived, the forest younger, the trails worn by feet not yet forgotten by history. She saw a people who lived in harmony with the land, who understood its secrets and respected its power. And she saw what dwelled beyond the door. It hadn't always been imprisoned. Once it roamed freely, a thing of mist and shadow and countless watching eyes, ancient when the mountains themselves were young. Not evil, precisely, but utterly inhuman, with desires and purposes incomprehensible to mortal minds. But there was something else, something worse, something that even the entity feared, something that had been bound beyond this world but was forever seeking entrance. Elise witnessed the ritual, the luring and trapping of the entity not out of malice but necessity. It became the watcher at the door, the guardian against a greater darkness. A prison built to contain one being became the sentinel against another. The visions shifted, showing her the door through centuries, how the people who created it died or left, how their knowledge was lost, how the warnings they carved became indecipherable marks to those who came later. Then, with sickening clarity, she saw her own family approaching the door, saw Ethan pushing it open, saw the watcher, freed from its post, slipping into the world while something else, something vast and hungry, pressed against the weakened barrier between worlds. Elise gasped, her body convulsing as she returned to consciousness. Elise! Daniel held her tightly, relief washing over his face. What happened? I saw, she whispered, her voice hoarse. I saw everything. Slowly, with Daniel's help, she sat up, her eyes now clear but filled with a new knowledge that frightened them all. The door, she said, it wasn't built to keep the entity in, it was built to keep something else out. The entity was its guardian, trapped, yes, but with purpose. A watcher at the threshold. A watcher? Ethan echoed. When we opened the door, we didn't just free it. We abandoned our world to whatever waits on the other side. Elise's voice grew stronger as she spoke. The entity wants one of us to take its place because it needs a watcher, always. Daniel shook his head, still clinging to his crumbling rationality. This doesn't make sense. None of this is real. It can't be. Before Elise could respond, a change came over Sadie. The girl straightened, her posture suddenly adult, her face transforming, subtly until it barely resembled their daughter. When she spoke, her voice resonated with multiple tones layered together, some deep and guttural, others high and keening, all inhuman. Your kind calls what it cannot understand unreal, the voice said through Sadie's mouth. Yet it is more real than your brief existence. Daniel stumbled back, the last of his skepticism shattering at the sight of his daughter's body housing something ancient and other. Sadie, he whispered. The child remains. The entity replied. She is compatible, a vessel that can hear us. Let her go, Ethan demanded, stepping forward despite his terror. The entity turned Sadie's head to regard him with eyes that now resembled the void eyes in the trees, depthless black pools that reflected nothing. You opened the door that should remain closed, it said. The balance is broken. A watcher must stand guard. What happens if we don't? Daniel asked, finding his voice again. Sadie's body smiled, a terrible stretching of lips that revealed too many teeth. Then what waits beyond will come through. And it hungers for more than minds or souls. What are you? Elise asked, leveraging herself up to stand on shaking legs. We are the watcher in the door. We are many and one. We have stood guard since before your kind named these mountains. And now you want one of us to take your place, Elise said, to become the new watcher. The door must be sealed, a guardian must stand, one must remain. Why should we believe you? Daniel challenged, though his voice wavered. The entity's anger flashed across Sadie's face, and the air around them grew colder. Believe or do not, the truth remains. What waits beyond the door is waking. Already it stretches toward your world. As if to emphasize its point, a deep rumbling shook the ground beneath them. The trees around the clearing bent inward, their trunks creaking. The void eyes widened, showing terror for the first time. Choose, the entity commanded. One must stay. One must become the Watcher. And if we refuse, Ethan asked, then all are taken. With those words, the presence withdrew from Sadie. She swayed, then collapsed into Elise's arms, her face once again that of their 13-year-old daughter. But the damage was done. None of them could deny what they had witnessed. Is it true? Daniel asked Elise, his voice breaking. What it said about someone having to stay? Elise nodded slowly. The visions showed me. The door needs a guardian. Always. Another tremor shook the ground, stronger this time. In the distance, they heard a sound like tearing fabric, as if reality itself were being rent apart. It's coming, Sadie whispered, her eyes fluttering open. Whatever waits beyond the door. I can feel it. How do we find the door again? Daniel asked, looking around at the darkened forest. I know where it is, Sadie said, sitting up. I've always known. It's been calling to me. Then we go there, Daniel decided, his military training reasserting itself in this moment of crisis. We find the door and we figure this out. As they helped each other to their feet, preparing to follow Sadie's lead, the sun finally disappeared completely below the horizon. The darkness that fell wasn't the darkness of night, but something older and more absolute, a primordial void from before light existed. In that darkness, they knew with terrible certainty that dawn would never come unless they restored the Watcher to the door, and that meant one of them would never leave these woods again. They followed Sadie through the absolute darkness, guided only by her otherworldly certainty and the faint phosphorescence that now emanated from her skin, a subtle blue-white glow that hadn't been there before. No one mentioned it. After everything they'd witnessed, a glowing child seemed almost mundane. The forest had transformed completely. The trees were no longer recognizable as any earthly species, their trunks twisted into impossible geometries, branches curving back on themselves in ways that hurt the eyes. The void eyes watched from every surface, not just the trees but the ground itself, the rocks, even the air, which seemed to thicken and thin in rhythmic pulses like the breathing of some vast organism. We're getting closer, Sadie said, her voice distant. I can feel the door. As they pressed forward, the darkness ahead seemed to part, revealing not light but a different quality of dark, a corridor through the impossible forest that led toward something ancient and waiting. Suddenly, Daniel stopped walking. His face went slack, eyes fixed on something only he could see. Daniel? Elise touched his arm. What's wrong? He didn't respond. His breathing quickened, coming in short, panicked gasps. Dad? Ethan moved toward him, but Elise held him back. Don't touch him, she warned. Something's happening. In Daniel's mind, the forest had vanished. He stood alone in their suburban home, but everything was wrong. The furniture was overturned, windows shattered. Blood stained the carpet. On the wall, written in that same blood, you couldn't save them. He ran through the house, calling for his family, but found only emptiness, until he reached Sadie's room. There, lying in a neat row, were 3 bodies covered with sheets. With trembling hands, he pulled back the first sheet, revealing Ethan's face, eyes open and accusatory in death. The second sheet covered Elise, her expression frozen in terror. The third was Sadie, looking peaceful but unmistakably gone. You were too rigid, a voice whispered in his mind. Too controlling. You pushed them away. You weren't there when they needed you. No, Daniel whispered, falling to his knees beside the bodies. Please, no. In the forest, Elise watched, in horror as her husband collapsed, tears streaming down his face as he battled against some invisible nightmare. Before she could help him, Her own vision blurred. The forest faded, replaced by flames. She stood before their burning home, heat searing her face as the inferno consumed everything they had built together. Through the flames, she could see figures, Daniel, Ethan, and Sadie, trapped inside, their silhouettes black against the orange blaze, hands pressed against windows that wouldn't open. "You abandoned them," the voice told her. "Just like you abandoned your dreams. You were too afraid to fight. Too weak to protect what matters." Ethan, meanwhile, found himself standing in a hospital corridor. Looking down, he saw his own body on a gurney, doctors working frantically to restart his heart. His father stood nearby, face wooden with shock. His mother sobbed in a corner. Sadie was nowhere to be seen. "Your recklessness killed you," the voice said. "Just like it's killing your family now. You never think before you act. You opened the door because you wanted to defy your father, and now look what you've done." He watched as the doctors stepped back from his body, shaking their heads. Watched his mother collapse into his father's arms. Watched as the entity that had been tormenting them materialized behind his parents, wrapping elongated fingers around their throats while they remained oblivious to their danger. One by one, the Calloways were forced to confront their deepest fears and regrets. Nightmares, tailored specifically to break them down, to weaken their resolve for what lay ahead. Only Sadie was spared the worst of it. While her family suffered, she continued walking, drawn inexorably toward the door. The entity's influence over her was different. Less an attack than a seduction, a whispered promise of understanding and belonging. She had always been different, always felt things others couldn't see or hear. Now she knew why. "You are chosen," the voice told her. "You have always been ours." When the nightmares finally released them, the adult Calloways found themselves on their knees, gasping and disoriented. They had arrived at their destination. The door stood before them, embedded in the mountainside just as they had first discovered it, though now the carvings glowed with the same phosphorescence as Sadie's skin, and Sadie herself stood directly before it, one hand raised as if to touch the ancient wood. "Sadie, no," Elise cried, lurching to her feet. Sadie turned, her expression serene but her eyes no longer entirely human. "It has to be me, Mom. I'm the one it wants." "No!" Daniel roared, finding strength he didn't know he still possessed. He staggered forward, positioning himself between his daughter and the door. "You're not taking her." A laugh echoed through the clearing, the same guttural sound they had heard before, but louder now, more confident. The trees surrounding them bent inward, their void eyes fixed on the family. "The child is compatible," the voice said, no longer needing Sadie's mouth to speak. "She hears us. She understands. She will make a worthy guardian." "Take me instead," Ethan said, stepping forward. "I'm the one who opened the door. This is my fault." "You are unsuitable," the entity replied, dismissing him with cruel indifference. "Too impulsive, too undisciplined. The Watcher must be steadfast." "Then take me," Daniel said, his military bearing reasserting itself. "I'm disciplined. I'm steadfast. That's what you want, isn't it? Someone who won't abandon their post?" The forest fell silent, as if the entity were considering his offer. Then came that terrible laugh again. "You misunderstand the nature of the sacrifice," it said. "We do not merely require a body to stand guard. We require willing surrender, fear, desperation, the breaking of bonds." "What do you mean?" Elise asked, though she dreaded the answer. "The door is sealed with more than flesh and bone," the entity explained. "It is sealed with choice, with submission, with the severing of love." Sadie's voice cut through the entity's pronouncement, small but clear. "It wants us to choose, Mom. Someone has to volunteer and the rest have to let them go." "That's monstrous," Elise whispered. "That is the price," the entity replied simply. "It has always been the price." Daniel looked at his family, at Elise, whose strength he had only just begun to recognize, at Ethan, whose defiance masked a deeper courage than Daniel had ever given him credit for. At Sadie, his sensitive child, who had somehow been in tune with things beyond his understanding all along. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "I'll stay." "Daniel, no." Elise grabbed his arm. "Dad, you can't." Ethan moved beside his mother, united with her for perhaps the first time in years. "It has to be me," Daniel insisted. "I've spent my whole life trying to control everything, everyone. And look where it got us. I led us here. This is my responsibility." The entity's presence seemed to coalesce in the air around them, watching, with cruel interest as the family's bonds were tested. "Noble," it acknowledged, "but insufficient. The child is our chosen vessel. She has been marked since before her birth." "You can't have her," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "Please, take me instead." "It is not that simple," the entity replied. "The Watcher is not merely imprisoned. The Watcher becomes one with us, 1,000 eyes seeing across the threshold. The vessel must be compatible. The child's mind is open to us in ways yours cannot be." The ground trembled beneath them, a reminder that whatever waited beyond the door was growing impatient. The void eyes in the trees widened in what might have been fear. "There has to be another way," Elise pleaded. "There is not," the entity stated flatly. "One must stay. One must watch. Or all will be consumed when what waits beyond comes through." As they argued, Sadie moved closer to the door, her expression shifting between her own childlike fear and something older, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous. The entity's grip on her was tightening, her will merging with its own. "Mom, Dad," she said softly, her voice momentarily her own again. I think it has to be me." The family fell silent, the terrible reality of their situation sinking in. One of them would not be leaving the forest. One of them would remain forever as the Watcher in the door, and time was running out. The darkness surrounding them began to thin, not into light but into something worse, a kind of anti-light that revealed more than it should, showing dimensions and angles that hurt the human mind to perceive. The trees twisted further, their trunks spiraling inward until they resembled frozen black tornadoes. The ground beneath their feet softened and hardened in rhythmic pulses, like standing on the surface of a breathing lung. Reality itself was coming undone. "What's happening?" Ethan asked, his voice thin with terror. "It's coming," Sadie whispered, her eyes fixed on the door. "Whatever waits on the other side is almost here." The door began to vibrate, a low hum that they felt more than heard, resonating in their bones and teeth. The carvings glowed brighter, their patterns shifting and flowing across the wood like living things. "Time grows short," the entity announced, its presence condensing in the air before them. For the first time they could see it fully manifested, not as the tall, thin figure glimpsed through the trees, but as something older and more terrible. It had no fixed shape, shifting constantly between forms that suggested a human silhouette, but were fundamentally wrong. Too many limbs appearing and disappearing, joints bending in impossible directions, features flowing like liquid across what might have been a face. Only the eyes remained constant, void black orbs that opened and closed across its form, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds, all watching the family with ancient hunger. "Choose now," it commanded. "One steps through willingly, or all are taken." Daniel moved in front of Sadie, shielding her with his body. "You can't have her." "Then you doom your world," the entity replied, its form expanding, filling the clearing with undulating shadows. "What sleeps beyond the door will wake. What hungers will feed." The door's vibration intensified, the wood beginning to splinter along its edges. Through the cracks, they caught glimpses of something moving in the darkness beyond, something vast and patient and hungry. "We have to do something," Ethan said desperately, looking between his parents. "Dad, there has to be a way out of this." But Daniel stood frozen, the man of action finally confronted with a situation he couldn't control, couldn't fight, couldn't plan his way out of. His face crumpled in despair, the weight of their impossible choice crushing him at last. Elise watched her husband break, saw the terror in her son's eyes, felt the entity's grip tightening on her daughter. In that moment, a terrible clarity came to her. She had seen the visions, had glimpsed the entity's true nature and purpose. She alone truly understood what was at stake. She knew what she had to do. Moving with a calm that surprised even her, Elise stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder. "It's okay," she said softly. "I understand now." Daniel looked at her, confusion mixing with his fear. "Elise? I've always been the one who sees things," she continued, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "The things you missed, the things none of you could see. It's why I felt the wrongness of the door from the beginning." "Mom?" Ethan's voice cracked. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm compatible too," Elise said, looking directly at the entity. "Aren't I? I saw your visions, I understood them. My mind opened to yours." The entity's countless eyes focused on her, narrowing in consideration. Its form contracted slightly, becoming more humanoid as it studied her. "Perhaps," it acknowledged. "Your mind touched ours. You saw truth." "Then take me," Elise said firmly. "Let Sadie go, let my family go." "No!" Daniel lunged forward, grabbing Elise's arm. "I won't let you do this." Elise turned to him, her expression filled with a love so fierce it was almost painful to behold. "Daniel, listen to me. All your life you've tried to protect everyone, control everything. But you can't control this. You have to let me choose." "I can't lose you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You have to," she replied simply. "For the children. One of us has to go home with them." Ethan moved beside his father, his face streaked with tears. "Mom, you can't. There has to be another way." "There isn't," Elise said gently. "I've seen what waits beyond the door. It can never be allowed through, someone has to watch." The entity drifted closer, its interest piqued by their exchange. "Willing sacrifice," it hissed, the words rippling through its ever-shifting form. "A mother's love, strong binding." While they argued, Sadie had been standing silent, her eyes fixed on the door, listening to something no one else could hear. Now she stepped forward, reaching out to touch her mother's hand. "Mom," she said, her voice suddenly clear and entirely her own. "Wait." Everyone fell silent, even the entity seeming to pause in anticipation. Sadie looked up at Elise, her eyes momentarily clear of the entity's influence. "In your vision," she whispered, "the first watcher had a name, before it became the guardian, before it was trapped." Elise stared at her daughter, realization dawning. In the overwhelming flood of visions she had glimpsed it, the entity's true name, from before its imprisonment, from when it had been something else entirely. "Ilyarath," Sadie whispered, the name like a breath of wind through ancient leaves. The effect was immediate and shocking. The entity recoiled, its form contracting violently, eyes blinking out of existence only to reopen elsewhere. A sound like 1,000 voices crying out in shock echoed through the clearing. "The name is forgotten," it roared. "The name is lost." But Elise understood what Sadie had given her, not salvation, but leverage. A moment of confusion, a sliver of control. She acted instantly, pushing Daniel back with surprising strength and shoving Ethan and Sadie toward him. "Take care of them," she said, her eyes meeting Daniel's one last time. "Let them be free." Then before anyone could stop her, Elise turned and flung herself toward the door. It swung open at her touch, revealing the absolute void beyond. The entity lunged for her, but too late. Elise crossed the threshold, stepping fully into the darkness. "Mom!" Ethan screamed, trying to follow, but Daniel held him back with iron grip. From within the void, Elise's voice came to them one last time, not frightened but resolute. "I love you. Now run." the door began to swing shut. Through the narrowing gap, they caught a final glimpse of Elise standing in the darkness, her form already changing, eyes like the void opening across her skin as she turned to face what waited in the depths beyond. Then the door slammed closed with a sound like the end of the world. The entity's form dissipated like mist in morning sun, drawn back through the cracks around the door, pulled inexorably toward its prison. The void eyes in the trees blinked, shut one by one. The forest groaned, twisting back toward normalcy, though nothing would ever be truly normal again. Sadie collapsed, the glow fading from her skin as the entity's presence withdrew from her mind. Daniel caught her, cradling her against his chest as he stared at the door in mute horror. Ethan sank to his knees before it, hands pressed against the ancient wood. "Mom," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Mom, please." But there was no answer. Only the soft sound of the forest returning to life around them, birds cautiously beginning to sing as the first genuine light in what felt like centuries filtered through the trees. Dawn had come at last. But for the Calloways, the world had gone dark forever. The door stood silent, its carvings no longer glowing but etched deeper than before. And among them, a new pattern had appeared, one that looked disturbingly like Elise's face, eyes closed in eternal vigilance. The Watcher had taken her post. For a long time, none of them moved. The forest around them had returned to apparent normalcy, the twisted trees straightening, the void eyes vanishing, the unnatural darkness giving way to the pale light of an ordinary Appalachian dawn. Birds resumed their morning songs, and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves overhead. Nature reclaiming its territory, as if nothing otherworldly had ever happened here, except for the door, and the woman who had walked through it, never to return. Daniel stood rigid, still holding Sadie against his chest, his eyes fixed on the ancient wood that had taken his wife. The door seemed smaller now, less imposing, just a weathered slab set into the mountainside, its carvings no longer glowing but still unmistakably alien. "Dad?" Ethan said finally, his voice hoarse from screaming. "We need to go." Daniel didn't respond, didn't even blink. "Dad?" Ethan tried again, touching his father's arm. "Sadie needs to get out of here. We all do." Slowly, as if waking from a trance, Daniel looked down at his daughter. Sadie's eyes were open but unfocused, her body limp from the sudden withdrawal of the entity's presence. "Elise?" Daniel whispered, the name like a prayer and a curse in the same breath. "She's gone, Dad," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "She's gone, and we need to leave before whatever happened starts again." At the mention of potential danger to his remaining family, Daniel's military training finally reasserted itself. He shifted Sadie in his arms, cradling her more securely. "You're right," he said, his voice hollow but determined. "We need to get down the mountain now." Ethan cast one last desperate look at the door, as if hoping it might open and reveal his mother unharmed, laughing at their foolishness for believing in ancient entities and otherworldly threats. But the door remained firmly shut, as solid and unyielding as the mountain itself. They turned away and found to their surprise a clear trail stretching before them. The same maintained hiking path they'd followed up the mountain initially, now restored as if it had never vanished. Whether this was the entity's parting gift, or simply the natural world reasserting itself, they couldn't tell. Neither possibility offered much comfort. With Daniel carrying Sadie and Ethan leading the way, they began their descent. No one spoke. What words could possibly address what they had seen? What language could contain their loss? They had gone perhaps half a mile when Sadie stirred in her father's arms. "Dad," she murmured, "I can walk." He set her down gently, his hands lingering on her shoulders as if afraid she might disappear like her mother. "Are you sure you're okay?" Sadie nodded, though her eyes still held a distant quality that hadn't been there before their ordeal. "I can hear the birds again," she said simply. They continued down the trail, moving as quickly as their exhaustion would allow. The forest around them seemed peaceful, almost apologetic in its beauty. Sunlight dappled the path through vibrant green leaves, and wildflowers nodded in gentle breezes. It was as if the mountain were trying to erase the memory of what had happened, to convince them it had all been a nightmare, nothing more. But the vacancy in their family, the space where Elise should have been walking beside them, told the truth. Some nightmares don't end when you wake up. As they neared the spot where they had first ventured off the main trail, where Sadie had discovered the door, Daniel's pace slowed. "Should we?" he began, not finishing the thought. "No," Ethan said firmly. "We're not going back." Daniel nodded, shoulders slumping in a mixture of relief and despair. Part of him had wanted to return, to try once more to save Elise. The rational part knew it was impossible. Whatever Elise had become, she wasn't coming back. But as they passed the turnoff, Sadie suddenly stopped walking. "Wait," she said, her voice oddly calm. "I need to see it one more time." "Sadie, no," Ethan began. But she was already moving, slipping between the trees with the same uncanny certainty that had guided her before. Daniel and Ethan exchanged a look of alarm before hurrying after her. They found her standing before the door again, her small hand pressed against the ancient wood. "Sadie," Daniel pleaded, "please come away from there." Sadie didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him. Her head was tilted in that listening posture they had come to dread, her fingers tracing the carvings that now included a pattern resembling her mother's face. "She's talking to me," Sadie whispered. Daniel moved closer, fear warring with desperate hope. "Elise, can you hear her?" Sadie nodded slowly. "She says she's okay. She says the Watcher is teaching her. She says—" Sadie paused, her expression shifting to confusion. "She says it isn't over." "What does that mean?" Ethan demanded, keeping his distance from the door. "I don't know," Sadie admitted. "That's all she said. It isn't over." As they watched, something strange began to happen to the door. Vines, which had covered it when they first discovered it, began growing at an accelerated rate, spreading across the wood and curling around the frame. But unlike natural growth, these vines moved with purpose, weaving themselves into patterns that matched the door's carvings. And among them, forming in delicate green tendrils, a name began to appear: Elise. "We need to go," Daniel said urgently, pulling Sadie away from the door. "Now." This time she didn't resist, allowing herself to be led back to the main trail. As they resumed their descent, Sadie glanced back one last time at the place where the door lay hidden once more. "Goodbye, Mom," she whispered, too softly for the others to hear. The rest of their journey passed in a fog of exhaustion and grief. When they finally reached the trailhead where their car waited, the ordinary world seemed alien, too bright, too loud, too oblivious to what lay hidden in the mountains above. Daniel drove mechanically, his normally alert posture slumped over the steering wheel. Ethan stared out the window, his face hardened into a mask that kept threatening to crack. Only Sadie seemed at peace, watching the scenery pass with quiet contemplation. As the mountains receded in the rearview mirror, Daniel finally broke the silence. "We can't tell anyone what really happened," he said, his voice flat. "No one would believe us." "What do we say happened to Mom?" Ethan asked, the practical question bringing fresh pain. "She fell," Daniel replied after a moment. "A hiking accident. We couldn't recover her body." The lie settled over them, the first of many they would tell to protect themselves from both well-meaning concern and potential institutionalization. The truth would remain sealed behind the door, just like Elise. Days later, as they tried to resume some semblance of normal life, the differences in each of them became apparent. Daniel moved like a ghost through his own home, going through the motions of daily routine while his mind remained trapped in that forest, forever replaying the moment Elise stepped through the door. The once rigid, controlling father now drifted, without purpose, leaving decisions unmade and conversations unfinished. Ethan, who had defined himself through rebellion, now carried a quiet vigilance that aged him beyond his years. His defiance transformed into a fierce protectiveness toward what remained of his family. The teenage troublemaker was gone, replaced by someone who understood all too well the consequences of reckless actions. And Sadie drew page after page of intricate patterns that resembled the door's carvings, sketches of twisted trees with eyes, and portraits of her mother, not as she had been, but as something other, something ancient and watchful with void eyes opening across her skin. At night, when the house was quiet, Sadie would sometimes press her ear against the wall listening, and sometimes, very faintly, she would hear whispers, her mother's voice, changed but recognizable, telling her secrets from beyond the door. One evening, as Daniel passed Sadie's room, he found her sitting cross-legged on her bed, apparently talking to herself. "Honey?" he asked cautiously. "Who are you talking to?" Sadie looked up, her expression serene. "Mom," she said simply. "She visits sometimes." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. "Sadie, your mother is—" "I know where she is," Sadie interrupted gently. "But she can still reach me, and she says to tell you something." "What?" Daniel asked, afraid of the answer. "She says the door isn't just in the mountain. It's everywhere. There's a threshold, and sometimes it opens." As Sadie spoke, she smiled, a slight curving of lips that didn't quite reach her eyes. And for just a moment, in the shadows of her bedroom, Daniel could have sworn he saw darkness, swirling in her pupils like tiny doors opening onto an endless void. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.